This week on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation with Robin Hanson, professor of economics at George Mason University, thinker on honesty, signaling, disagreement, forecasting, and the far future, and the man behind the blog Overcoming Bias. It's the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. Robin Hanson is a professor of economics at George Mason University, a research associate at Oxford University's Future of Humanity Institute, and a chief scientist at Consensus Point. He's also a prominent thinker in the blogosphere with Overcoming Bias, his blog on honesty, signaling, disagreement, forecasting, and the far future. Robin, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
There are a lot of ideas of yours I want to discuss, and there's not enough time in the day, let alone on this show, to discuss them all. So I'm going to get into this with a bit on an idea that I think bears on this very discussion, which is that, it's one of my favorite ideas of yours, or ideas that you've written about. And it's that if we are both honest truth seekers, we should not, over the course of this discussion, disagree. Is that correct?
It's more than just this discussion.
Oh, yes.
It would be any discussion between any two people who were honest truth seekers on any matter of fact. And it wouldn't have to be by the end of the discussion. It would be at any point in time. We should not be able to anticipate how the other person would disagree with us. I should be able to just pick a topic right now and guess your next opinion on it. And my guess of your next opinion should be the opinion I'm just stating to you right now. So if I say, I think this interview will last an hour, my best guess of how long the interview, what you'll say for the interview lasting, should be an hour.
This is naturally going to sound sort of hard to get the mind around for somebody who's listening and is not familiar with what you've written about. In this particular idea, they'll say, well, but people disagree all the time. Humanity is here essentially to disagree with one another. How do you quickly get it across to someone like that why there shouldn't theoretically be disagreement?
Well, of course, the whole reason this is interesting is that you have a theory that differs from behavior. So it's a normative theory. It says what you should do. It doesn't say what you do, but it gives you some idea of how we're going wrong in a certain sense. So the key idea is just that we should be respecting each other's opinions. That is, I don't know how you came to your opinion. I don't know what evidence it's based on. I don't know what reasoning you went through or analysis. I'm sure there's lots of noise and errors in that whole process. But nevertheless, I think you were trying to estimate the truth. And that's the key point. So when you tell me your opinion, I take that very seriously as a summary of all the things you know and think and have analyzed up to this point on that topic.
And so what gets in the way of the reality actually matching the theory? I mean, for example, I could probably come out stating an opinion of mine as a fact. I could be overstating the probability of some guess I'm making. I mean, I imagine that's one way this could go off the rails. Why else does it not match up with the theory?
The first thing to notice is that theory and reality do match up on lots of ordinary topics that we don't care about. It's when our pride or enthusiasm gets hyped up that we start to disagree. But if you and I were walking down the street and I said, I think there's a tree around the corner or something, you probably wouldn't disagree with me there. Or if you said, no, there isn't, and I would suddenly say, oh, okay. Where our pride isn't on the line, or we're working together on a project, or we need to achieve something, maybe our job is at stake, then we are much more likely to be reasonable about these things. But when we talk about politics or religion or whatever we talk about on these radio shows, that's when we're much more likely to not be reasonable and not to listen, and to find it, more enjoyable to speak than to listen.
And so the topics then, like politics, like religion, these are topics where people can hold opinions, but when they hold them, they don't actually act on them much of the time. Is that correct?
That's true, although it also applies to topics that you do act on, but where your pride is on the line. So, CEO versus a subordinate director might disagree, or we might disagree about some actual, business decision we're making, or we might disagree about what restaurant we should go to and which one is likely to be open and tasty. We disagree on things where we'd rather think that we're right. It's very pleasant and affirming to think that we're right and they're wrong. And we might rather indulge that feeling than actually be right.
And in life, when you can foresee a disagreement kind of coming down the pike with somebody, do you have an easy way of sort of testing whether or not the belief that's going to be disagreed about is one of these, I don't know if volatile is the right word, but one of these pride-based beliefs or identity-based beliefs?
Well, there's not much need to, because it's pretty easy to see when you're tempted to disagree. I mean, it happens all the time, constantly in our lives. I mean, I can take pretty much any two people and give me 5 minutes with them, and I could probably identify, half a dozen topics in which they disagree. I mean, imagine you could do that as well.
And when you're observing this, I mean, just in any context, you would be observing this. You talk about, you mentioned religion, you mentioned politics. Is there a typical suite of sort of defined beliefs, defined areas of belief that are always going to be, or very often going to be, conflict points?
I mean, I think you can just look inside yourself. You can see how people are reacting when they get emotional, when they get energetic, when it really seems to matter to them. But again, this phenomenon is so widespread. There's really not much of a need for a diagnosis to see when it's happening. It's almost everywhere.
It does tie up with one of the main themes of your blog, which I mentioned, Overcoming Bias. I mean, it's not solely about, of course, what the title says, or maybe you could frame it that it is, but there's so much to do with, and what I find is particularly interesting is that there's so much to do with the gap between, how to put this, and tell me if you agree, the gap between people's beliefs that they actually live by and people's beliefs that they, to use your own words, wear like clothes. Is that a good summation of a decent chunk of what you cover in the blog?
Yes, although in a sense it's worse than that.
Okay.
I think to a good first approximation, for example, our conscious minds are something like the PR department of our minds. Our minds have this vast depth that we're usually not aware of much. When we want to present ourselves to other people, we talk, and we pay attention to how other people perceive us. And that part of our mind that manages that is the part that we're most conscious of, that we're aware of. And a lot of that is done with an eye to how it looks and how it will make us seem to other people, whether we seem loyal and intelligent and thoughtful and submissive or dominant as we wish. Our whole conscious mind is designed to manage that process. And sometimes it's in our interest, in the PR department's interest, to be reasonable and accurate and careful, but many other times it's not. And that's the hard thing in looking inside ourselves, to realize that even when we're very sincere, we're rarely honest, in the sense that we're not being very careful to be accurate. But it sure feels sincere to us. We look inside and say, yeah, that's what I really think.
So the sincerity-honesty gap, the sincerity being the side where you think you're being true to your own thoughts, but if you were being honest, honesty is what you get when you correct for the mental PR department?
Honesty is when you're really trying hard to be accurate.
Oh, okay.
So to be honest, you have to think about possible criticisms and take them seriously. You have to ask what the evidence on the other side would be. You have to wonder who has who has supported which sides of a position. If you're going to be honest about something, there's a set of considerations that you're supposed to look at, which we all pretty much know what they are. But when we're sincere, that doesn't mean we've done those sorts of things.
And this PR department that's evolved in our human brains, obviously it's had some advantage over time. So why the desire to overcome its effects?
Well, clearly, if you just want to be successful in the way your ancestors were successful, I think the environment you're in hasn't changed substantially in relevant ways for this since then you should do what your intuitions tell you to do. You should go along with the PR department and sincerely think that you're honest about whatever you say. On the other hand, if you really think it's important to be right about something, if, for example, you're actually concerned about the future or global warming or something like that, and you actually think it matters more than just a convenient talking point for parties or for showing your loyalty to some side of some coalition, then you need to go beyond that sort of intuitive, easy sincerity to try to be more honest.
How far does this effort toward truth seeking go back in your own life? I mean, I recall on your website there's a few questions you wrote at a very young age asking about the nature of certain things. But how long have you thought of yourself as in the mission of truth seeking?
Well, I mean, I actually think most people think they are,
Oh,
unfortunately. It's just a common point in almost every person's life when they at least think they do some thinking, is that they see the people around them who have beliefs that they don't quite understand, and they decide for themselves that, well, I must just be more honest than those other people. I must be really just trying harder, because that's the easiest way to explain your disagreement with other people. Because we do disagree, and it does bother us. We know at some level that something's not right about that, and we're eager to find explanations. And the easiest explanation that usually comes to mind is just our own superior sincerity or honesty. It's just a quick and easy explanation. We're not very honest about considering that explanation.
there is, of course, also, in addition, I'm just going to jump in here and add this, the people don't just go to that. They don't go to their own honesty as an explanation. They also go to, well, okay, maybe everyone's got a different truth, something I would call more pernicious, but not more widespread.
Yeah, but people usually don't really mean that. I mean, it's a nice diplomatic way to settle a temporary dispute. But if you really mean that, we all have our own truth, and in some level you don't really think you have a truth. What you think you have is a way of thinking that comforts you and helps you deal with things and that sort of attitude. And you might think it's a good way of framing your life in order to help you get through the day, and et cetera. But you don't really believe it's true unless you believe things that contradict it are false.
It's
right?
true. It's true. I can tell this is going to be a theme of this discussion. I'm probably going to bring up a lot of things people say that I assume they mean, but I could think about it a little and realize they probably don't actually mean that.
There's a sense in which they mean it sincerely. They just don't mean it honestly enough to follow it through two steps of inference to the next conclusions that follow from it. So there's that level of dishonesty, in a sense, of not bothering to notice what implications a belief has in order to check whether it actually is the sort of belief you want to hold.
Now, I derailed what I was asking, but what was how far can you, how closely can you pin down the moment where you said, I've got to dedicate myself to truth-seeking as a life mission?
Well, I'm not actually sure I ever did
Okay.
that. I'm not even sure I'm doing it now. I'm really trying to be honest. It's certainly a fun hobby. It's certainly it's a nice way of organizing the kinds of things I'm interested in, and it certainly pushes people's buttons to tell them that that's what I'm doing. But if I actually look at all the different things I do, I'm not sure I can put together a strong case that I'm actually paying high prices or costs to do that. So I'll have to be honest there and say, I'm trying somewhat. I'm not going to put myself up as an exemplar there.
True, but at the same time, there's been, and I've been surprised and actually quite happily surprised at this with Overcoming Bias that has become your own blog, and the other sort of rationality, the constellation of rationality communities that have popped up on the internet kind of as a result of that whole thing. There seems to be a lot of people who respond to the truth-seeking ideals that you state. This seems to be what I call it, an unquenched thirst up to this point. There's kind of there's a current that I didn't notice before of truth-seeking that people didn't seem to be able to define until they started reading your blog and others. Does that line up with your observations at all?
Well, I think there's always been a current of people who thought in those terms. Certainly a large chunk of philosophy professional academic philosophy is in those terms, and it's always been an undercurrent of many areas in the world. But the blogosphere has become larger. It allows more refined topics. It allows more refined publications. So I think we're just seeing a niche being filled out as the blogosphere has fragmented into a wider range of topics.
But since so much of the sort of sub-blogosphere, the rationality sub-blogosphere has developed around the sorts of things you do on the net, I mean, what do you think of how it's developed? You've seen it kind of come up around you, this specific community. There has to be something quite fascinating about the emergence of a rationality community in that setting for you.
There's easy ways and hard ways to deal with, and unfortunately, the hard ways are the more honest ways.
As usual.
So, if you recall that during the Bush administration, many Democrats were calling themselves the reality-based community, by contrast to the Bush administration. They thought Bush folk were delusional and self-admittedly so, and they were, of course, trying to be realistic. Honestly, this goes way back. I mean, in almost any long-standing dispute, usually both sides think of themselves as the realists, and the other side as delusional, and people have long not just wanted to claim that, but like to have little things they can point to as justifying evidence. So there was obviously a whole literature on heuristics and biases that came out of psychology 30 or 40 years ago with Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize recently. And a lot of people have loved that literature because it shows why the other guys are wrong. So there's long been, a fascination and fad with that sort of thing. Obviously, many academics who say can master mathematics look down on people who don't use mathematics as obviously delusional because they don't have access to the formal methods that are the key to being accurate. People who study vast amounts of details in history or sociology think of themselves as the people who are honest because they're actually paying attention to detail and reality, as opposed to those delusional theorists who are lost in their own abstract thoughts. And so, again, a lot of what we have is a community of people who would like to pat themselves on the back and say, I'm rational, those people aren't. And they feel a little more able to say that sincerely to themselves if they've, tracked a few rules of thumb about how to tell the difference between rationality or not. But the key question is, how hard really are you trying to be honest, as opposed to wanting to get a badge of honesty so you can beat it over the head of people you disagree with. Again, we're back to disagreement.
Given that, how is it more frustrating to look for honest rationality in the sphere of politics or academia?
Well, they overlap substantially.
Ah.
We're more familiar with politics. Obviously, politics is a really hard area for people to be honest in. The emotions and the confidence just wells up so quickly and fully that it's really hard to knock down. It took a lot of effort for me to put on my webpage years ago that my main opinion about politics was, I don't know. Too many people are too confident in what they think they know. But that doesn't win you many friends or allies in the great world of politics. That's not, if you were on the other side, they might think that was good for you to have admitted your uncertainty, but not for people on their side. Now, academia is interestingly different in the sense that the main divisions in academia are mostly over method as opposed to conclusions. Conclusions are secondary. What academics usually invest themselves in is how to study something. And by the time they've spent 5 or 10 years learning how to study something a certain way, they are very sensitive about the idea that that's the best way. And which topics they apply the method to, they're much more flexible on. And if their method came up with a conclusion that was different when they initially held, they're willing to embrace it because it embraces their method and shows how they're the best sort of academics because they're using the right method.
So as a broad sort of observation, we might say a politician can get hung up easily on a conclusion and find any way possible to stick to that, whereas an academic is more likely to stick to the method they have come up with, no matter where that method leads.
And in some sense, the academic at some level isn't that interested in the conclusions. At some level, academia is about just showing that you are an impressive person via the methods you've mastered.
It doesn't sound like, we talked about the rationality communities you can find online, but those are directed specifically at rationality. It sounds to me as if there's no really sphere in the public world where you can find much more rationality going on than in other places. Is that correct?
It's hard to say because so many people would like to appropriate the label to themselves. Yes. As soon as any group started to acquire a reputation for being more rational, that reputation would suddenly be contested by people who thought that would challenge their rationality. So there's remarkably little positive energy toward wanting some sort of neutral analysis or rationality, but there's an enormous amount of energy in wanting to deflect other people's claims to be more rational.
I think back to a post you had, a brief post on overcoming bias, the subject line of which was neutrality isn't popular. And that sounds like you could say it. I think you were talking specifically about history, but it sounds like you could apply that pretty much anywhere. Actual neutrality is not popular, though it sounds as if the word neutrality is extremely popular.
Right. If you created a political think tank and started to publish white papers and you consistently did very neutral analyses in these white papers, you would get almost no donations of support. There would be nobody paying to do this. Pretty soon it would be gone, and you wouldn't be getting much in the way of donations or people signing up for membership in your organization or any of those sorts of things. They would just be almost complete disinterest. On the other hand, if you are take a side in some battle, you can certainly a niche for people who are taking a side but nevertheless claim and try to give the outward appearance of neutrality. They will, take a neutral academic tone, and they'll use numbers and analyses, and then they will try to, however possible, seem to be a neutral analyst. But they will, of course, only get money and support and attention to the extent they are thought to identify with some side. So similarly, neutral, even, or government agencies that offer neutral analysis are relatively unpopular.
This may be going a little bit down the rabbit hole, but how popular is neutrality versus what one might expect, even within the specifically rationality-oriented communities?
Well, they're, I guess, too small and diverse to easily characterize. People like to collect methods, certainly, and there's some sense to that. That's somewhat different than endorsing a neutral institution. So, for example, I'm a big advocate of this concept of a prediction market. This is a betting market, which would be on an interesting, important question, so that one way we could produce a neutral, reliable estimate on a topic would be to create a betting market and then invite many people to bet or even subsidize them and then see whatever the betting odds are. Now, a great many people nod and say, yes, that sounds like a great idea.
Yes.
That's a good idea for how we should, as the world, be rational and produce rational beliefs. On the other hand, people who are big fans of rationality are usually not very interested in spending much time creating or participating in such markets. They would rather sort of talk more about rationality, which of course makes sense if what you're really doing is just talking in order to achieve the other sorts of things everybody else achieves by talking. So at a very basic level, as you probably noticed from Overcoming Bias, I try to be very honest about sort of the nature of the social behaviors we have and what their origins are, what functions they serve. And many of them are said supposedly to be trying to achieve truth, but that's usually not very plausible. And the other explanations we have are not especially noble, but at least they're more illuminating. And conversation is one of those things we do because we like to pretend we're sort of acquiring truth, but that's not very plausible.
And one of these ways behavior might be less noble than we would initially think is the concept of signaling, which I think a lot of people read about on your blog, and that's kind of what hooks them, is the way you describe what normal things or things we think are normal people do turn out to have this signaling function. Now, how best to describe what signaling is? I mean, a lot of it comes through in the name, but
sure.
What is signaling?
Well, so again, a lot of what we do is as a PR department function. We're trying to look good to other people. It's very important to our humans now and to our distant ancestors to look good to each other. We were a large social species. We had large tribes. Our large brains were probably that large mainly in order to handle the social complexities of figuring out how to deal with each other in a large tribe. And a great deal of what we had to figure out is who we're impressed with so that we want to affiliate with them, and who we're loyal to or who is loyal to us. And was extremely important for them, and it continues to be important for each of us to both figure out in other people how impressive and loyal they are, and also in ourselves to try to give that impression to other people. The idea is a lot of our behaviors that don't make that much sense in terms of apes trying to feed themselves and stay warm make a lot more sense in terms of that sort of function. So if you look at the kinds of things humans do that other apes don't, like talk for all hours about strange abstract things, or draw art, or throw balls through hoops, or a great range of other things we do that just don't make much sense from the point of view of a typical animal, make a lot more sense as ways that we can show off to each other. This concept of signaling or showing off or showing our characteristics has some details that help you make more sense of it. So there's this key idea that you need to do something that can't easily be faked as a signal of either your ability or your loyalty. Obviously, you can just say you're able or you're loyal, but other people should be skeptical about mere words like that. You have to figure out how to do something that actually seems more impressive and loyal. So, for example, academics are trying to signal that they are very smart, very well-read, very knowledgeable, who have mastered difficult techniques. So when they write articles for journals, the text of the article says, here we are discovering some new insight about the world, and isn't this great? We're all learning more about the world. But of course, the subtext is, look how impressive we are in this complicated analysis we've done. And if you actually look at how academics choose each other in terms of hiring or publications, they focus almost entirely on that impressiveness of the effort and very little on the actual content of the conclusion. Academia largely isn't about the content of the conclusion. It's largely about showing how impressive you are through the methods you can master and display, which makes perfect sense as animals who descended from others who were trying to impress each other. And of course, why should such people be trying to understand the nature of the universe or something like that?
It does seem like there's quite a few reasons evolutionarily why the deck is stacked against our figuring out the nature of the universe. I mean, when I think about this, I'm actually surprised that humans have discovered as much truth as they have. Do you have the same thought?
Sure. I mean, obviously there's something really remarkable about the human brain that allowed it to have an amazing breadth of range of topics it could consider, and a set of abstractions it could master, and those abstractions have gone remarkably far in helping us understand a wide range of things. Of course, we are tempted to overrate how much we've done. Truth be told, the main reason we are rich and powerful has relatively little to do with our ability to do abstract reasoning. We were very proud of how much we understand about the stars or mathematics or things like that. But economic growth is largely driven by lots of small modifications and improvements that we slowly accumulate over time, for which this more abstract reasoning isn't especially useful.
Now, with signaling, thinking about signaling a little more, I want to kind of turn it back on myself. And I think, okay, well, on one level, I'm asking you a question because I feel that I am curious to know the answer. And I do feel that listeners it would be a more interesting world if listeners were exposed to Robin Hansonian ideas. But on the other hand, it's plausible that I'm signaling my interviewing skill to gain higher interviewing status, correct?
Right. Very plausible. Of course, the problem is that it's hard to consciously accept that. So, and of course, this is in general true about all sorts of theories of human behavior that aren't very pretty. They're much easier theories to accept about other people than about yourself. We have this whole, PR spiel that our minds are all set up to give about ourselves. And we're also relatively willing to be cynical and negative about other people who aren't at least our close allies. But turning that around on ourselves is just really hard.
I don't find it all that unpalatable, though, now that I think about it. I can accept that I am trying to gain more interviewing status.
Right. In the abstract, you can accept it. But on each particular thing you're doing,
right,
it's going to be much harder to think about that particular thing as applying those particular functions. And we understand a bit about why we are this way. You might say, well, why doesn't the PR department just be honest about it's trying to push PR? Everybody knows it anyway. Or you could say, why aren't we just really honest about the fact that we're really just trying to impress each other? But we understand a bit about why, say, bragging looks bad. And why people who are too eager to show off show an insecurity that's not very impressive. It's actually moderately low status and unimpressive to be too eagerly trying to impress. And so we're better off impressing people indirectly and unconsciously even, because we evolved, that way. It's also, of course, related to the fact that it's easier to sincerely be a good salesman on something if you actually sincerely believe in your product. Not necessarily honestly believe in your product, but sincerely believe in your product. You don't give off as many clues about sort of the reservations you might have if you were more honest.
If you've just tuned in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. You can find our complete interview archive at colinmarshallradio.com. My guest is Robin Hanson, professor of economics at George Mason University and thinker on honesty, signaling, disagreement, forecasting, and the far future. He's also the blogger behind Overcoming Bias. How well does it work to say to yourself, okay, well, I'm seeking status, but maybe I'll try to, and to what extent can you try to sort of bump yourself into status-seeking endeavors that happen to have the most, that happen to generate the most positive byproducts for humanity or whatever? Is that possible, or is that delusional?
It's certainly possible at a broad, crude level. Question might be how fine-grained you could take that, but certainly in general, there are a wide range of things you can do to be impressive, and a great many of them, honestly, don't do that much for humanity in the long run. And it's not that hard to analyze the consequences of many things you do in order to estimate those consequences. So clearly, I mean, if you're trained like I am as an economist, you'll be familiar with a wide range of ways we analyze behavior to see what are called externalities, side effects that people aren't taking into account. And we can identify where there are positive and negative externalities. And in some sense, status seeking has this negative externality of putting other people down when you're bringing yourself up. But there are other sorts of things, ways that behavior can have positive externalities. And innovation is clearly, at least innovation that has a long-term legs, is one of those big positive externalities. And so to the extent you are achieving status through the right kind of innovation, then you might be doing something better for the world. Don't fool yourself into thinking that you really wanted to do something for the world because you really cared that much about the world, but perhaps even so, as long as you could move yourself in one direction or the other, maybe you can at least show that you like to appear more altruistic and concerned about the world by choosing to show off in ways that actually do help the world.
It does remind me of a post on Overcoming Bias. It was part of I believe a blog-to-blog sort of discussion where you were discussing charities and how charities seem to serve more of a signaling function than anything. And then someone replied that, well, there's this one service that finds out which charities actually do the most that actually generate the most measurable benefits. And I believe you replied, correct me if I'm wrong, yes, but then you can have you can put out the signal that you are investing in the effective charity, and thus you're smarter and higher status than everybody else who is putting their money into charity. You can always make a signaling explanation by kind of going one level up, can't you?
There's the ability to always offer an explanation and the ability to actually marshal evidence in support of it.
I see.
So I don't want to offer this as something that equally explains every possible observation you could make, because then, of course, you really can't ever confirm it by your observations. So you could offer it as an explanation for a wide range of things, but it becomes less plausible depending on the details of the behavior. But I do think that, in fact, I mean, it's not very plausible that humans evolved to care about the universe or the world. But it is plausible that we evolved to try to appear to be caring, the sort of person that if you were to be married to us or work with us at an office, that we would be considerate and observant of you and take you into account. And those are nice signals to send out. And so we clearly evolved to that. We also evolved to show ourselves as being reasonably smart and thoughtful. And if we offer an argument for something that's transparently silly, then that makes us look silly or stupid, and we don't like to do that.
When I talk to people who occasionally read your blog, or they don't follow it that closely, but they kind of do, they'll sometimes say things like, "Yeah, I like it, but he's always bringing up the status and the signaling. It's always about the status and the signaling." And I think that's an interesting framework to view humanity in. But at the same time, I suppose there's the danger of looking like you're leaning very heavily on a small number of factors. And is that ever something you feel like you have to act to make it seem like you're not doing, to look like you're leaning less heavily on those two?
It's actually more the other direction.
Oh, really?
But by nature, you might notice that I'm just interested in a very wide range of things.
Yes.
And it's just intuitively, I easily pursue a wide range of topics and a wide range of thoughts. But I know that I'm in a very large world, and if I actually want to make a contribution to the world, or even just get attention and respect, I need to specialize.
Right.
And that's hard because it's more natural to sort of be broad and cover a wide range of topics. So I try to make myself specialize. Obviously, I'm not specializing on just one thing, but I'm specializing at least on a more narrow range of things. And it seems to me that because people are interested in these signaling and status topics, that I should make myself try to focus more on them. And I do try to do that to some extent. So that's the nature of the world of specialists.
But it seems like status and signaling, you can take those to anything humanity is doing, and you can profitably, or at least interestingly, examine, whatever human effort you're looking at through that framework, and you'll still be able to get the variety. It's just kind of a very specialized method of looking.
It's a degree of specialization. Obviously, if I specialized on signaling in the arts, that would be more specialty. If I focused on signaling in the dance arts, that would be even more specific. So you have to choose how specific to become. I don't think it's obvious that all explanations are equally valid. So let's just take conversation for an instance. One theory of conversation that people like to present is it's about sharing information, sharing knowledge. I talk and I share my insights and my knowledge with you, and then you talk and you share your knowledge and my insights with me, and it's an exchange. It's a trade. We're offering each other our insights and knowledge in a mutually beneficial trade. Another theory of conversation is that we are trying to show off. Now, you could say either of these theories explains the fact that people talk, so you might think they were equally valid explanations, so how would you ever know the difference? But a very simple prediction that's different between the two theories is that the information theory says I'm eager to listen and reluctant to talk. If I was going to cheat on the deal, I would be most likely to cheat by not offering you as much information and trying to get as much as possible from listening and not so much talking. On the other hand, the signaling theory, where I'm trying to show off my various characteristics, says I should be eager to talk and reluctant to listen. And of course, we all know the answer here.
And of course, in this specific conversation, I've essentially asked you to come on the program and show off. So in this specific example, if we look at this very conversation we're having, I've put my thumb on the scale and sort of
Sure.
essentially said you for me.
But you, of course, as a radio host, show your thoughtfulness and your taste by the kind of people you choose to bring on, and you also show that even though they're a specialist on a topic and you're a generalist across many topics, you can still hold your own.
That's
so that's
true. I'm
kind of a way of
that.
you're kind of showing your generality and robustness by the ability to hold your own in a conversation with dozens of specialists on various other topics.
Showing my robustness. That should have been the title of the show. I've got to go back and rename it. To go a little back into your own life story, there is a term that you've used several times on your website, and I believe on the blog as well, the idea of viewquakes. Now, what are these?
That's just a way of talking about an insight that really changes how you think about a wide range of things. Or goes to the heart of important things. It's the sort of news that's big news in a sort of fundamental intellectual sense. So you might think it's trivially the sort of thing that most people would be eager to find. That is, if you have a simple model of intellectuals as people who are trying to understand the world and trying to make sense of things and make intellectual progress, you would think this would be the top. This would be the very best thing you could ever get. And people would treasure these viewquakes, these great insights that really changed how they thought. And their intellectual history would be composed of those as the high points and the kind of contributions that they might hope to make to the rest of the world. They might hope to do something in that direction. And if they could ever produce something like a viewquake for others, they would think they would have achieved enormous intellectual accomplishment and beyond the hope that most people should be able to do. But in fact, people are not very interested in such things, surprisingly. So that has to help you revise your sense of what most intellectuals are up to or trying to do.
But you enjoy these view quakes, it sounds like. I mean, what are some of the view quakes that are most memorable for you?
Well, the first big sets of view quakes, I would suppose, were around physics, because I first learned physics in a solid, deep way. Obviously, relativity, quantum mechanics, thermodynamics, these have some deep insights that are just extremely counterintuitive, but once you become to appreciate them, they make a lot of sense and help you understand a great many things. So physics had that range of view quakes in it for me. Another set of view quakes when I left physics and I went into computer science, I really had no idea of how to deal with complicated systems and how to manage them. And I didn't even realize there was a need to deal with that. Physicists have been taught to think that they know most everything important. And so I, of course, thought that as well. And as I learned about modularity in software and abstraction and those kinds of concepts that help me manage complexity in software, I was really struck by how powerful those insights were. And then in social science, I, of course, also came across a range of insights that were extremely powerful and useful and still counterintuitive, just the very simplest concepts of supply and demand, of incentives, of rationality. And in my early education as an economist, I also came across this standard result about disagreement, which was quite a view quite to me. This result, the simplest version of the result, that people who are trying to be honest would not knowingly disagree. And then, of course, I also came across a range of view quakes, I suppose, on various issues about how the future might be different from the present, of similar dramatic degree to how the present is different from the past. And that's always striking to see how very different other parts of the universe are from where you are.
And I definitely want to talk about the future as well, because I know you have many thoughts on that topic. But I want to ask, you moved, of course, as we just said, from the field of, well, you had the earlier education was in the field of physics, and then there was computer science, and then the move to social science or to economics. That doesn't happen very often with people. Why is that so rare, do you think?
Plato and Aristotle have nice things to say about that. I think it's really quite common to think that young people can have a good grasp of something like physics or mathematics, but it takes many years of experience with the social world to really have a sense for how the social world works to be able to study it competently. And so I think and then, at some level, even politics is even harder. In order to really appreciate the difficulty in politics, it really helps to understand a lot of other ordinary human organizations and interactions before you try to get to that level. So there's a sense in which there's just a lot of prerequisites for that course.
It's true, but here's the thing that I noticed that's different about you as opposed to other people that I've met who have studied or gone into physics or computer science, is a lot of those people that I've met, they get into the physics, they get into the computer science, and then for them, physics, computer science, those become the things that matter. And the social world is something ephemeral, something surface, something insubstantial to be ignored as much as possible in favor of physics, in favor of computer science, and so on and so forth.
I mean, there's tendencies that cut both ways here. So honestly, there's a big tendency that cuts the other way, which is that, as I indicated before, human minds are naturally built to be relatively general. This is the remarkable power of the human mind, that it's so general and flexible to apply to a wide range of things. But what that also means is that we are built to expect to be able to apply our minds to a wide range of topics. And we aren't really built to expect the enormous division of labor that we find in our world. This is a recent addition, an enormously valuable, powerful change to the world, but it also is somewhat at odds with our mind's expectations. So we have to adapt ourselves to this specialization. And so there's a degree of adaptation, and in a sense, most of the intellectual failures I know, in the sense of being very smart people who just still fail to achieve intellectual development, insight, or a career, largely is because they just find it hard to make themselves specialize. They're so interested in such a wide range of topics that it's really hard to focus enough. to become successful enough in a narrow topic in order to get a job or fame or things like that in it. So I'd actually say what you see in terms of the people who have some degree of fame or some degree of attention or achievement in some intellectual area is those people having become an exception to the rule, that is, they manage to make themselves focus enough to do that. But of course, the side effect of that is going to be that they continue to focus. They continue to stay in that narrow area because that's what's going to give them their success.
Might this create the public mirage that there are more obsessives in the fields of science than there actually are because the obsessives tend to rise to prominence?
Well, sure, but it's also that we all learn how to adapt ourselves to the world we live in. We slowly do adapt. So in some sense, relative to what we could have become in a different world, we are all more specialized because we have made ourselves become more specialized at some internal resistance, but still we see where the winds blew and decided that's what we needed to do. We can't all specialize in everything. And there's some sense in which, we do differ in our innate abilities. I think there's some truth to the nerd scenario, which is a nerd is somebody who understands intuitively social relations less than they understand some other things. And then it makes sense for them to focus on those other things, go with their strengths rather than their weaknesses. I think there's just a lot of truth to that.
There's another concept on overcoming bias that you think about a lot on there, and you've thought about a lot on there recently from what I've read. It's the idea of near versus far modes of thought. And what are those? How do those differ?
There are dozens of ways to divide up the brain into two parts, right? There's conscious, unconscious, left, right, intuitive, logical, etc. Most of these ways to divide up the mind seem to have some relation to something we see. But this near-far relation actually seems to be relatively deeply embodied in the mind, and actually it seems at a architectural level. It actually seems that our minds have a near mode and a far mode for processing things, and these are just different modes, and they produce different kinds of thoughts. When you look out upon a scene, what you'll see usually is some things that are near to you and other things that are far away. And literally, the things that are near to you are being processed in near mode, and the things that are far are being processed in far mode. And when you pause and think about people living in China or Haiti or versus the person in the office next door, you're also thinking in far mode more about the people who are farther away. And similarly, if we think about the distant future, you start to think more in far mode. So we just have these modes that we switch our mind between. The main reason, of course, is that things that are closer to us have more detail. We just need a different way of thinking about things that have more detail to manage that detail. And things that are further away, we focus less on the detail. We focus more on abstract categories that they're in.
What problems does this create, the fact that we seem to have a near and far mode? Because when I read about you, when I read your posts about it, it seems like this causes, it helps, but it causes trouble as well when we're trying to think about complicated things.
Obviously, we need to be able to handle detail, and if we thought about everything far away as if it had lots of detail, we would just run out of space in our head to think about things. So clearly, we need to have these different modes at some level. But what it also seems is that our minds have adjusted the parameters that describe how we think in far mode to take into account the fact that far mode thoughts usually make less personal difference in terms of our decisions and more social distance in terms of how people think about us. So things that are farther away in time or in space or in social distance, when we think about them, other people are more likely to sort of hear our thoughts and to judge us based on our thoughts relative to how much it matters for what we actually do. One concrete example, for example, is love versus sex. Love is a far mode thought. Sex is a near mode thought. The way we think about love, or the way we feel love, is designed in large part as PR to present to other people this image of ourselves as a caring, thoughtful, committed sort of person. And we do achieve that, and we are that sort of person in far mode when we think about love, but those love thoughts often don't actually influence concrete behaviors in ways that would be expensive relative to, say, the near mode thoughts of, say, sex. When you are focused on sex, you are in a very near mode where you're focused on details of concrete things very close in space and time, and other abstract thoughts go away. Near mode thoughts are extremely important because who you have sex with is extremely important. And so you are much more concretely focused on, well, is this a good person to have sex with?
And as far as far mode's effects on, even in, let's say, the scenario of the future. The future is it seems to be your favorite topics on the blog. How does FAR mode affect the way people in general think about the future, maybe versus the way you yourself do?
Oh, I don't know if it's about me personally versus other people, but it's more about all the other things that come with FAR mode come into thinking about the far future. And in fact, the literature actually that focused on this near-far analysis actually started with observations about how people think differently about the distant future. People noticed that when you asked people the same question about something farther away in time, they thought about it very differently, and they explored that further to see this whole near-far structure. So when we think about things farther in time, we also tend to think about things farther in space. So space colonization makes so much sense to us about the future. Not because we actually have any good evidence that it's very useful or interesting. It's just, it makes perfect sense that far things away in time would be far away in space as well. It also makes sense to us that the far future will be populated with creatures who are very far from us socially. We love the idea of sort of visiting aliens and all sorts of odd, strange cultures. And of course, that would be the kind of thing that would happen in a far future. We'd have far social acquaintances. And similarly, we tend to think that simple trends or theories about human behavior or society would be clearly and obviously follow through to their logical conclusion in the future, whereas they don't today. So when we see the world today, we see it's a complicated mess, and we kind of acknowledge that it's hard to tell what's about to happen which way. But when we think about the far future, all of that fades away, and we think there are these clear trends toward, increasing niceness or increasing wealth, or being more logical, or whatever it is we think is some general trend about thought. We think that's going to happen in the future. But of course, it's also true that we're just less careful about thoughts about the future, and this is sort of another sort of mark of FAR mode. We're more into sort of loose associations and vague analogies, and that's enough for us in FAR mode, because we're not actually like trying to avoid getting squashed by something or dying or something like that in the far distant future. It's just more of a entertaining place to spin yarns, where it's more like talking about, a dragon story and a fantasy or something. You tell those stories and you're moderately careful not to be obviously inconsistent, but you're not very careful to think the whole thing through or something because, it's just a story after all.
So when we think about the future, how much can we counterbalance this drop in resolution that FAR mode gives us? Or is it important to do that?
Yes, it's important to do that to the extent we actually make choices now that affect the future.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you were concerned about global warming and you were actually going to impose a large carbon tax or some cap and trade system today because you were trying to prevent problems in the distant future, then it suddenly becomes a lot more important that you've actually thought through the details of this distant future rather than projecting onto this future various concerns you have about feeling guilty that we're consuming too much or that we're not spiritual enough or we're not unified enough at a global level. Or these sort of vague concerns that you'd like to express through your concern about the future. I don't mean to pick on them. It's also true of the opposite end of the hard techie science optimists about the future. They're also more interested in using the future as a way to talk about why science and tech is great than to be honest and thoughtful about what actually is likely to happen.
How do you be more honest and thoughtful about the future then? How do you avoid just putting money on your favorite horse subconsciously when you're discussing what's going to go on 1,000 years down the line?
I think there's more, how do you make yourself do what you know you already need to do rather than how do you do it? So, if you looked at something on the horizon and I asked you to sort of paint a detailed picture of what it looks like, you would move into a nearer mental mode because you needed to paint that extra detail. I think that's similarly true about thinking about the far future. So, for example, I'm an economist. I have a PhD and now I'm a professor of economics, and I learned a variety of mathematical and analytic tools for analyzing social behavior and social situations. And I think that for the distant future, you should pull all those tools off the shelf and apply them directly there. A mathematical and analytical frame of mind is a nearer frame of mind, even if it's more abstract in some sense, but it's more focused on certain kinds of detail. It's, there's the equation and the equal sign, and you have to make the symbols work out right. And that's, in a sense, a nearer mode of trying to be careful about those things. I mean, it takes not just a willingness ability, but a willingness. I mean, part of what goes on with the future, unfortunately, is there really are quite a few people out there with the ability and even inclination to think carefully and analytically about the future, but they're not really in much demand as inspirational speakers. So again, we have this larger problem of this huge selection effect of who do we choose as our people we quote on the future. And so any one person can choose to be more honest, and they can choose to be more analytic and more careful and more near-mode about the future, and they can then actually come up with more reasonable projections. And there are usually a range of people who do that, but they're usually not very popular. So I actually have this history of before there was a web, there were people who were thinking about and forecasting and projecting the web, and they did successfully predict many important aspects of the web. When the web showed up, people weren't very interested in hearing, those people didn't win very much. They didn't become rich or something because they had forecasted the web. And at the time they were forecasting web, people weren't very interested in those forecasts either, except to the extent they sort of spoke to important concerns people had about the little people or the big people, or math versus English. Or there was a range of ways people framed that issue as speaking to their concerns at the time, but they really weren't very interested in actually forecasting the web.
Another casualty of the unpopularity of honesty.
Yeah, basically.
Well, it's unfortunately we've run out of time and we've only scratched the surface. So, Robin Hanson, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and give us a taste of a fairly decent range of your ideas, I would say, though, right?
Thank you for having me.
If you'd like to find out more about Robin Hanson and Overcoming Bias, visit overcomingbias.com. This has been the Marketplace of Ideas. I've been Colin Marshall. You can find the website of Ben Althouse, the man who produces our theme music, at benalthouse.com. And be sure to check out our complete interview archive at colinmarshallradio.com. You can find a lot of other fun stuff there as well. And if you have any feedback, positive, negative, neutral, or anywhere in between those 3 points, send that along to Colin, C-O-L-I-N, at colinmarshallradio.com. Once again, thank you for tuning in, and we will catch you next time.